Does COVID-19 really exist?
Well, that's David Icke, one-time sports commentator, now very famous conspiracy theorist. Why am I bothering making a video about David Icke? Because one of his videos about coronavirus, which is pretty well UK focused, has been watched by 4.7 million people. And stories are coming out of people going around burning 5G radio masts because they think they're causing coronavirus. So, conspiracy theories. Now, one of the reasons conspiracy theories are flourishing is that people realise how bad the mainstream media is, just how chronically biased it is and unreliable as a source of neutral information. So that creates fertile ground for people to be taken in by other things, particularly on YouTube. You can watch things that prevent a very one-sided presentation, can sound plausible, and people take it on board. And then they start talking about it to their friends. Once you start saying something, then it's quite difficult to back down from it, to say, yeah, I was taken in by that nonsense. Yeah, but then I saw through it. Yeah, I was a bit stupid, wasn't I? Yeah, I don't believe that anymore. People are not so keen to say that. So once they start speaking about these things, it gathers a momentum of its own, and it can be quite hard to stop. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to go through some of David Icke's output, and I'm going to respond to it just off the top of my head. I haven't gone off and researched any of these things, but what I'm trying to show here is you don't actually need to. You should be able to see through it just at face value.
For 30 years, I've been warning people in my books and in every other way I can that this world is controlled by a cult. It's a cult that has no borders. It operates in all the, at least major countries, and in fact, all the countries in the end, and particularly in those countries that dictate the direction of the world. So the cult will be at the core of the system in China. It will be at the core of the system in America, etc., etc., etc. And so what have I said in this 30 years that this cult wants? I've said, and I've said it in the chats we've had before, it wants to create a beyond Orwellian global state in which a tiny few people dictate to everyone else. I've referred to this as the Hunger Games society. And you can picture the structure very clearly. Picture a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, you've got a tiny few enormously wealthy people that actually are connected to this cult. We now have a name for them. We call them the 1%.
So David Icke seems to know so much about this cult. So who are they? Tell us more about what you know. The 1% of the world's population, that would be 70 million people. That's an awful lot of people to be keeping a secret. Surely this is going to be leaking out left, right and centre. But it's not. So my big question to him is, how do you know?
At the bottom of this pyramid in the Hunger Games society is basically the rest of humanity that is dependent upon the 1%. And in between the two is a vicious, merciless police military state to impose the will of the 1% on the population and to prevent the population challenging the 1%.
So this cult wants a vicious, merciless police military state. Again, have you got documents to show that? Have these been leaked? Can you show us those? And these people already control things pretty well, is saying. Right, if these people who are set on a vicious, merciless police military state are actually in control behind the scenes, how on earth are they allowing David Icke to keep spilling the beans? How on earth have they not bumped him off? His very existence disproves his theory.
It is a technocracy. A technocracy is defined as a society that is controlled by bureaucrats, experts, scientists, engineers, technocrats. And the ability of that situation to happen is through smart technology and AI. The idea is that everything will be connected to AI. This is what the Internet of Things is all about. And if you listen to the crazies in Silicon Valley, they're telling you that in the period around 2030, a year that keeps coming up from all directions, we will have a situation where the human brain will start to be connected to AI. And thus, whoever controls AI will be connecting and driving the perceptions of humanity. And that can be done from a central point through this smart grid, global smart grid.
Yes, you heard that right there. David Icke was referring to some other people as crazies. So if these people can somehow control the perceptions of people in the future, why do they need this merciless military police? I don't quite get that. At the moment, there's no signs of progress in this direction. He talks about 2030. That's the big time when it's all going to happen. 2030, that's far enough away for you not to really worry that you can't actually see signs of it happening yet. If you're a prophet type, if you start predicting things in 2 weeks' time, well, that's pretty risky, isn't it? I mean, you could really be in a lot of trouble there. If you predict things 10 years away, well, you've got quite a lot of wriggle room. Let's say it gets to, say, 2028, this is not happening. Well, you can just start backing off on the 2030 business. Or how about if we do get to 2030? He can say, oh, it is happening, but we don't realize it. It's all undercover. And the reason so many people don't appreciate what David Icke's saying, why they won't believe it, that's because their mind is being controlled. But despite this total technological domination that's emerging, this little can't quite manage to knock David Icke off YouTube.
Now, in the same 30 years, I've been saying there are two major techniques that are being used to bring about that situation. One, I've called since the 1990s problem, reaction, solution, where you covertly create a problem, you use the unquestioning, pathetic mainstream media to tell the public the version of the problem you want them to believe. And you're looking at stage two, the reaction, for fear, that's the currency of control, outrage, whatever the problem is, and either a demand from the public that something must be done, or at least an acceptance from the public that things need to change because of the problem. And at that point, those who've created the problem got that reaction openly in changes in society, offer the solutions to the problems they have themselves covertly created. And those changes, step by step, take us further and further to that Hunger Games society.
Problem, reaction, solution. He's not exactly going out on a limb with his prediction there, is he? You're not really going to struggle to find examples of that in action. Of course, every problem gets a reaction. Of course, there's attempts at solutions. But people watching this on YouTube might be thinking, oh, he's onto something there. I can see that. That is the pattern, isn't it? So let's just think about an example. A major, massive problem, disaster. The 2004 tsunami. What changes did that make that have brought this world cult domination any closer? Now, obviously it hasn't. But if we asked him, he would have answers to that question. And the reason he would is that the tsunami was such a massive event, so complex, there'd be thousands of different responses across many, many countries. And out of that vast sea of data, he'd be able to pick out a couple of things that just might seem to support his theory one way or another. Edit them together all into one video, and it could maybe persuade people. I say I haven't done the research, but I bet if you go and look at what he was saying after the tsunami, this is exactly the line he would be taking.
The stablemate of problem, reaction, solution is what I call the totalitarian tiptoe, where you start at A and you know you're going to Z, but you know if you go in too big a leap, people will look up from the game show and the latest Simon Cowell and say, what's going on? What's going on? Because the change is so great. So you do it in as big a steps as you can towards your outcome, but not so fast or big that you alert too many people to the fact that it's a pattern. What you want people to believe is everything is random.
I'm saying that's a valid strategy. I get that. Again, people would listen to that and they go, oh yeah, I understand that. I can see what he's saying there. But what's the evidence of these steps? So going towards one world government by this cult, how does the UK leaving the EU fit into that? Surely that's pulling in the opposite direction. But I bet if you listen to what David Icke said about Brexit, it would actually be evidence that we're moving towards one world government. So to accept his theory, you've got to have evidence of these steps all in one direction, which doesn't exist, and evidence of the end point that's in mind, which again doesn't exist. He talks about people who are watching mainstream TV as being a bit thick. Again, appealing to people's pride. They're obviously not as smart as people getting sucked into his rubbish.
And I have this other phrase which relates to all this: know the outcome and you'll see the journey. If you don't know where this world is being taken by this cult, then everything seems random. Coronavirus, random. Climate change, random. Economic crash, random. But when you know where we're being taken, you know the outcome, this Hunger Games structure society, now the apparently random events become clear stepping stones to that outcome.
In other words, believe my theory and you can fit everything into it. Now, what about all the good things that are happening? All the things where people are becoming more free. But for David Icke, everything can fit into his theory. Just imagine in the future, imagine what disasters there might be. Imagine there's a famine in part of the world. Would that fit into his theory? Of course it would. What about if there's a problem with antibiotic resistance? Would that be more evidence for his theory? Yes. Any war? Yes. Civil unrest? Yes. Revolution? Yes. A leader assassinated? Yes. It would all be evidence for his theory. Anything can fit with his theory. Now, as the great philosopher of science Karl Popper said, a theory that can explain everything actually explains nothing. For a theory to have any explanatory power at all, it needs to make predictions that are falsifiable. There needs to be something that can happen that would make you think, ah, that's not what the theory would have predicted, so the theory's wrong. But with David Icke's theory, anything fits with it. For example, let's say a leader is assassinated. What does that show? That shows that particular leader must have been outside the cult, so the cults rigged it so he got assassinated. But what would actually be convincing is if he can predict for us which leaders are going to get assassinated in the future. So those sort of predictions would have some sort of credibility, but for the moment, his theory explains everything, so it explains nothing.
Now, let's take all of that and apply it to the coronavirus and what's happening now, and let people decide for themselves if they think that the fact that the coronavirus hysteria ticks every single box of that outcome, that goal, whether that's a coincidence.
Well, of course, it doesn't appear to be a coincidence to David Icke, because the boxes that are ticked, allegedly, are so generalised that any problem fits into them. But you can see how people get drawn into this. You can see them thinking, oh, I can see what he's saying there. But imagine this theory. This is my conspiracy theory. Aliens are trying to make us depressed. They're controlling the weather. They sometimes make the weather good just to build up our hopes, so they can then dash them with bad weather, because they've worked out that's how you make people most depressed, and they keep repeating this cycle. So sometimes you have a longer spell of good weather. That's just to build up your expectation, to get you used to the good weather. Then you're more depressed when the bad weather comes. Sometimes they do really long spells of bad weather, and the reason they do that is that just makes people really depressed with it being so bad. Now you just watch the weather from now on and see if you notice that pattern I've described. Well, of course you do, because anything fits with it. Just taking a step back and looking at his alleged reasoning here. It's not deductive, it's not logical, it's not inductive, that's like scientific reasoning. It's abduction. Abduction is that inference to the best explanation. It's a valid form of reasoning. It's just he doesn't get to the best explanation. Another principle that can help us to realize what's wrong with his explanations is Occam's razor. That says when you're looking for an explanation, then you should choose the one that proposes the least new entities or effects. In other words, stick with the simplest explanation unless you've got very good reason to believe in the existence of these other entities or effects that are in your proposed explanation. So David Icke's theory fails miserably in that regard.
I absolutely do not believe that it is. And, you know, you mentioned that you don't think that it was a created virus. But the fact is, whether it was or whether it wasn't, doesn't matter to the fact that once you roll this out, it takes on a momentum of its own.
I agree with that.
And therefore, what is unfolding was desperately predictable.
Was it predictable? I didn't hear David Icke predicting it recently. Anyway, I'm sure he would claim he did predict coronavirus. I'm sure on page 364 of his 13th book, there was something that sort of vaguely sounds like it among his hundreds of other predictions. So what David Icke's doing there is hoping that people are not familiar with the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Now, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is based on this idea. You've got a barn and the Texas sharpshooter, and he takes his gun and he fires, say, 10 times at the barn, just randomly. The bullets are all over the place. What he does then is he goes along to one of the bullet holes, paints a target around it with his paint, with his bullet hole right in bullseye, covers up all the other holes, and gets his friends round and saying, look, I'm the Texas sharpshooter, smack in the middle of the target. I got it. So I think David Icke, he could say, well, what he's actually talking about is you could have predicted the response to coronavirus. Well, of course you could. Anyone who knows anything about how to slow the spread of an infectious disease would have predicted the sort of measures that are coming about now. So he's not exactly a prophet there, is he?
And in fact, we'll get into this as we chat, two massive 1% organizations, one in fact 6 weeks before this virus came to light in China, were playing out scenarios and simulations based on exactly this scenario that's unfolding now. And what they said would happen is exactly what is happening, down to the fine detail.
But naming those two organisations would have seemed the obvious thing to do at that point, but you didn't. But it is possible that organisations were simulating, modelling this sort of thing, because that would be happening routinely. There are experts in this field, and that's their job. And it went roughly the way they'd rehearsed? Well, yes, because people have been expecting some sort of flu pandemic for decades. What David Icke's saying is a bit like this. He's saying there was a house fire down the road yesterday, and just last week the fire brigade were practicing for exactly that sort of thing. I saw them. They were going up ladders, squirting water on fires, and then when that house caught fire, they were doing exactly the same thing.
Okay, but the coronavirus is real and it is dangerous. You do believe that?
Well, not as a black and white, no.
Okay, but it is real?
Obviously, there is a strain of this coronavirus, because there are many coronaviruses, which appears to be different. But if you look in terms of the danger is to a certain section of society. 80% of people that are diagnosed with coronavirus have, and this is his quote, very mild symptoms. The ones that are in danger, and by the way, in danger from any virus, including the classic flu.
Now, I think here he's deliberately implying a logical error. It's not stated explicitly, but he seems to be saying people who are more in danger of coronavirus are also more in danger of sort of ordinary flu. And I think the message he's trying to convey is that coronavirus is no worse than flu, which is obviously wrong.
Are those that have compromised immune systems. And they are old people, elderly people.
Have you got that? Two groups of people, old people and elderly people.
And they are people with what is termed pre-existing health problems. Why? The pre-existing health problems are putting so much pressure on the immune system, it's already weak when it's hit with this. This is why someone like that will have potentially a serious situation, and someone with an immune system in working order of any level will just swat it away.
I think what he's saying there is basically correct. I'm not sure his terminology is always accurate, but how does he know this? Because what he's saying there is the information that's been given out by scientists, the media, the government. But I thought they were all corrupt and can't be trusted.
96% plus of those who have been tested for coronavirus in South Korea were negative. And she said, and our testing results in America show about the same. And so when you are in a massive way, you are diagnosing on the basis of symptoms. How the hell do you know they've got this coronavirus strain and not something else?
96% negative tests in 2 different contexts. That's a completely meaningless statistic. It depends on how many people you test and how many people have got the virus. The fact that it came out at 96% negative in 2 places is an utterly useless piece of information. If you're assuming some random sampling, and it did actually show that 4% of the population had coronavirus in 2 different contexts, well, so what? That's the point at which it is, and the virus will continue to spread. But his biggest blunder here is he thinks that coronavirus has been diagnosed on the basis of symptoms. In other words, they're saying, oh, someone's got a cough and their temperature's up. They must have coronavirus. Let's add them to the statistics. That obviously isn't what's happening. There's a chemical test for it. Now, David Icke there has made such a massive blunder that his credibility on this topic is entirely destroyed. Well, it should be.
Me and my son, Gareth, well before Christmas, both went down with very, very rarely ill. That's why we remember it. We both went down with this illness. And now, as I read the symptoms of this coronavirus strain, we had word for word, point by point, every single symptom. And that means one of 2 things. It means either this coronavirus strain was going around in Britain then, before it had even emerged out of China, or, far more likely, we got something else with exactly the same symptoms. So I would hold back on believing the figures.
No one is claiming that coronavirus symptoms are unique, but David Icke doesn't understand the idea of a test for a virus. To be honest, I don't understand how tests for viruses actually work, but I do understand that they work somehow on a biochemical level, and that they do work. But David Icke, 4.7 million people have watched him spouting this ignorance.
I've been investigating the mainstream everything for 30 years. And, you know, most of the time, if they ever told the truth, they would genetically implode from the shock.
Genetically implode? What on earth does that mean? But you can imagine people watching it thinking, oh, genetically implode, that sounds like some technical thing, that sounds clever. I don't really understand it, but wow, David Icke obviously does.
We are being asked to believe now that this system cares about old people. We must protect the old people. We must destroy the world economy to protect the old people. Oh, these would be the old people, would they, that have paid in their entire life through taxation and other means, and at the end, in their final years, they get handed a pittance of a pension which gives them the choice between being warm or being hungry. And what does that do? When people are going without essential things because the system doesn't care, and they're having to buy shite food because that's all they can afford. They can't have nutrients to boost their immune systems because they can't afford them, and the mainstream everything's not telling them they need them anyway. And at the same time, they're breathing in shit air, drinking toxic water and other drinks, being deluged with sugar, which has a phenomenally destructive impact on the immune system. All this is going on. We're living in an electromagnetic, technologically generated soup of radiation toxicity, and this system has allowed that to happen, has allowed corporations to do that, and now, having done all that, that's devastated the lives and the immune systems of old people, we are being asked to believe that the system cares about the health of the elderly. It doesn't give a shit.
Oh, sorry about his language there. But the message is that the system, the cult, the world, whatever, doesn't really care about old people. I see lots of ways the governments actually do care for old people. Anyway, he's saying things like the mainstream media doesn't tell people that they need nutrients. Oh, for goodness sake, I get fed up of hearing about diet advice and what sort of nutrients you need. Toxic water. So the 1%, they have a different water supply, do they? So they're deliberately poisoning everyone else while they get a different supply for themselves. Not quite aware of that. Pushing sugar. I mean, in Scotland, the government's forever banging on about how bad sugar is and trying to restrict it. Radiation toxicity. Again, sounds pretty sinister, doesn't it? Sciencey sounding, affects the immune system. Now, when it comes to electromagnetic radiation, okay, there are health risks associated to it, and you can read about those in scientific journals about where the safety measures are and how people are monitoring various things. But that's pretty well completely unrelated to his wild sort of supernatural scaremongering where it's about, you know, vibrations or whatever. But this is the sort of thing that's resulted in 5G radio masts getting attacked because people will think it protects them from coronavirus. So he's trying to say to old people, the system has been deliberately weakening you to make you vulnerable to coronavirus. Now, who's in on this plan? Lots and lots of people. It's coming from all directions. It's completely incredible. But it's an emotional appeal to old people. You're a victim. It's not actually that your immune system doesn't work so well when you get older. It's that the nasty cult has been undermining you. It's very much an emotional appeal to get people to feel like David Icke is the one person defending their interests against everyone.
I've thought all along, and it seems to be the case, that the strain that is prevalent in Italy is something of a stronger nature than what's generally circulating, and also in Iran. That's something else. Just as an aside, we have a country targeted by America, targeted by Israel, Iran, and as this virus came out of China, of all the countries in all the world, Iran got its smack.
So he looks at the high numbers of coronavirus in the early days in Italy, and he infers to what he thinks is the best explanation, but he's wrong, is it must be a different strain, whereas just it happened to be that it took hold there at an earlier stage. And then Iran had it quite early. Again, he thinks Iran's targeted. It's an enemy of the USA and Israel. A bit of an anti-Semitic theme bubbles under, I think, with some of his material. So they're obviously promoting the agenda of the global cult by targeting Iran with coronavirus. Why was Italy getting it more seriously? Well, he didn't have an answer for that. I mean, this video is a couple of weeks old now. Bit of a tricky question now about why the USA has got coronavirus very seriously indeed. Did they target themselves?
You look at the movie Contagion. I think it was 2011.
I watched it.
It's basically coming out of China and stuff like that.
Yeah, Steven Soderbergh. It's got Jude Law in there and Gwyneth Paltrow. It's very interesting and very well made.
Yeah, but you know, I've talked to you in previous chats about something called preemptive programming, where they preempt something to put it into the subconscious mind, even the conscious mind, through Hollywood.
The Contagion movie designed to plant the idea in our minds, the idea that experts have been talking about for decades, that this was a risk that was going to happen. But what's the point of that? To make people scared of it? Okay, is the film really going to make much difference? Maybe a little bit, but surely at this stage, it's the statistics about the effect of coronavirus that really is the effective thing. But again, he looks back at that film and employs his Texas sharpshooter ability again. Now, if every disaster movie that's out there is actually the cult priming us to fear something, well, we're in big trouble, aren't we?
You look at all the solutions to climate change, and again and again and again, they are exactly the same solutions and consequences as with the coronavirus.
Now, you've got to see his point there. Solutions to coronavirus, solutions to global warming, I mean, they are virtually identical. I mean, only the other day I saw a government film suggesting you fit solar panels to your house to avoid coronavirus. I mean, they're forever saying, if you're vulnerable, then we suggest you drive an electric car. If you start with a dry cough, make sure you're recycling your glass bottles. And he says all this with a deadly serious face, 4.7 million people watching. But anyways, that's enough for that video. We're now going to move on to a more recent video from David Icke, where his thinking has developed further.
And a lot of people will react to that and say, of course it exists. Government says so. They say so. People are dying of it. But how do we know that? Well, they told us, right. And again, I'm not saying people aren't dying. I'm saying, what of? And I concluded maybe 10 days, 2 weeks ago, that this virus almost certainly did not exist. And as the days have passed and I've researched more and more and more, it's become clearer and clearer to me that it doesn't. When nearly 200 people in China fell ill in Wuhan, the Chinese authorities tested, investigated just 7 of them. And what they did was take fluid from the lung. And they found genetic material. Now, this genetic material, it turns out, can be generated by a long list of different causes, a long list. But these Chinese authorities decided immediately that the cause of this illness was a virus. At no point did they isolate the virus.
Is it right or wrong about that? I'm not actually sure. I don't know much about viruses, but I know they sort of inject alien genetic material into the cell somehow or other. And I assume that the way they're testing for the coronavirus is the standard way to test for a virus.
And they immediately developed a test called the PCR test that doesn't test for the virus alleged to exist. It tests for this genetic material that can have a long list of other causes.
Now he's claiming there's lots of other potential causes for this distinctive genetic information. Now, I actually don't believe him there. It's a bit like he's saying the symptoms have many causes. What else causes this sort of alien genetic material to be found in human cells where people are suffering from an illness? Now, he seems to be suggesting that there's some sort of global conspiracy of virologists in dozens of universities around the world who are trying to sort of cover up and promote this method that obviously doesn't really work.
He talks about something called exosomes. And what happens is when the cell is poison, toxic, the cell releases something, secretes something, which are called exosomes. And these seek out bacteria and kill. It's part of the immune system. It's part of the defense system, perfectly natural. And without it, we'd all be in serious trouble and not around for very long. And what he identifies, and you'll see in this first picture, that the exosomes under the microscope and what they're telling us is COVID-19 are absolutely the same.
Have you ever wondered what molecular biologists do? Now you know. They look at nice little pictures of molecules and they see which ones look the same. I don't think so. These viruses, etc., they're extremely complex chemical structures and suggest that they're the same because they look the same in something with about as much resolution as a kiddie's crayon picture is just laughable.
So if you look at the next picture, you'll see a comparison between exosomes and COVID-19, and they are the same.
Same size, both contain RNA, found in the same place. These are trivial similarities. This isn't as intelligent as saying that a fridge and a washing machine are the same thing, because they're about the same size, they both contain metal, and you find them both in the kitchen. So that proves it. A fridge is a washing machine.
Fear and stress. Fear and stress generate electromagnetic frequencies which express themselves as chemical changes in the body, and they are a form of toxicity which the cell wants to get rid of. This is the process of how stress causes illness.
Well, that's just complete bunk. Stress causes electromagnetic frequencies. Well, any brain activity is electrochemical activity, so that will produce electromagnetic fields. That's just a fact with an electric current. Will it have a frequency? Well, sort of. Anything with a change can be described as having a frequency. It won't be a constant frequency. But there's no reason to think that the electromagnetic field generated in the brain to do with stress activity affects the body any differently than any other electromagnetism generated by brain activity. Now, stress does affect the body, but not in the way that he says.
So here we have billions of people around the world under lockdown, under stress, large numbers of them, out of fear of all the virus, and others, all of them, under some form of stress because they're basically under house arrest. And that stress is going to generate toxicity in the cells, which the cells will deal with by releasing exosomes, which this ludicrous test will measure as COVID-19.
So the stress of lockdown is actually what's causing people to test positive for COVID-19, and that's all part of the plan. So it's a global conspiracy to make people think that they've got the virus. Now, I'm not sure where all the people who are dying fit into this theory, but this is now getting so nuts, it's almost impossible to tackle. If someone presents an argument with a flaw or two in it, you can point out the flaws. But when it gets to this stage, I mean, where'd you start?
You go back to the so-called Spanish flu, which was nothing to do with Spain, of 1918. Two things happened. First of all, soldiers returning from the war were given massive numbers of vaccinations, saying that what they're doing is vaccinating diseases into people this way.
Vaccination, that's one of his standard causes of things. Now, conspiracy theories relating to vaccines are costing lives and are a serious threat to public health around the world. Because if the level of vaccination against some otherwise common illnesses gets too low, then the disease makes a comeback in the whole of society, and we're in danger of heading into that territory because of ridiculous conspiracy theories about vaccinations. Now, we mentioned Spanish flu here. It is true the second wave of Spanish flu did affect a lot of soldiers after the First World War, so particularly young men. And the reason young men suffered from it in particular was that particular strain of flu overstimulated the immune system, as I understand it. So those with a stronger immune system actually suffered more from it, paradoxically. But what David Icke's doing here is, again, it's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Look at the whole sea of information, you pick out the little bit you want, draw a target around it and draw attention to that. But it's also the post hoc fallacy. In other words, one thing followed another chronologically, therefore the first thing caused the second thing, which is obviously fallacious.
And another thing that happened before the outbreak of Spanish flu, which of course killed vast numbers of people, well in excess of, vastly in excess of what is being claimed now, was that intensive radar was introduced.
Again, you can always find evidence for his electromagnetic toxicity sort of theory. So he reckons now radar caused the flu virus or not virus or whatever. But again, this is post hoc fallacy, saying A happened, then B happened. Therefore, A probably caused B, didn't it? That's like saying my alarm went off at 6 o'clock this morning, the sun came up at 7. That's happened for the last few days. What does it look like causes the sun to come up? It looks like my alarm is the cause. Bit of Texas sharpshooter fallacy as well, focusing on the one little bit, ignoring the vast range of other information. But hang on, I thought the Spanish flu was caused by vaccines, but it was also caused by radar. Gets quite complicated. Another slight problem with this theory. I did actually break my rule here. I said I wouldn't go off and do any research. I thought radar in World War I. Surely radar was a new technology at the start of World War II. So I did a quick spot of research. That is actually correct. There's no radar in World War I.
And then we had Hong Kong flu in the 1960s, which again followed putting satellites up, firing electromagnetic fields at the Earth.
So if that's the case, if it was radiation from satellites, how come this flu started in one place and then spread via contact with people to a wider and wider group? Doesn't seem to make sense.
In 2019, up to the, quote, outbreak of this COVID-19, we had the introduction of 5G rolling out to more and more places. And where was it massively introduced? Ahead almost of anywhere. China.
So there we have it. We'd all better go out and burn down the local 5G masts to preserve our health.
People, we have reached the point where there's nowhere more to run. So we now gather some backbone and we grow a pair and we get together, which is why they're trying to keep us apart with this lockdown. We get together and we say we're not having it anymore, and we do what's necessary to not have it. And if we don't, well, nightmare's not the word in where this is going.
Team up with who? For what? To do what? To burn 5G masts? To kill the elite? But you can imagine people watching this and feeling at the end that they're in the know. They've got a grand theory that explains what's going on in the world. And this sort of conspiracy theories is quite a widespread problem in society. And one of the important ways of tackling it, I think, is to teach critical thinking in schools. Now, if you said to the Scottish educational establishment, come up with a critical thinking resource to teach in schools, it would all be based on current affairs and political moral issues. You'd get questions like this. Ted says Donald Trump is a great president because he's rich. Joanne says Hillary Clinton would have been better because she would uphold women's rights. Who has the strongest argument? They couldn't help but try and use it to promote their agenda. So they should teach critical thinking and logic out of any sort of political moral context. Just teach the principles, and that's really important. Teach people to assess arguments and to spot what's wrong with them, to assess evidence. Also then, just a general education helps to immunize people against these sort of conspiracy theories. If you know enough science to know what science is and how it works, you're not going to be taken in by this sort of thing. Now, when I say science, I mean proper hard science, not the sort of science you often get in schools, you know, draw a nice poster about climate change. I mean hard science that includes mathematical aspects. Now, some people might find that isn't really their thing. They find that quite tough. But maybe it's important to face up for that, face up to it, so you realize that that's what science actually is. Even though it's not actually your thing, you know what goes on in science. I think the answer isn't censorship. I think if you try and censor these things, that's just fuel for the fire. That's the cult trying to suppress opponents. Now, part of the reason I've talked about this, part of the reason it's come to my attention a bit more recently, is sometimes people will come along to Scottish family party meetings and then we'll start coming out with some of these things. And I sometimes worry that other people might have come to the meeting, they'll be hearing this, they'll be thinking, oh, what is this bunch of people? Who's this group of people I've come to listen to? I mean, are they all a bit crazy? Now, if someone's been a bit gullible and swallowed one of these theories, it doesn't mean they're a really bad person. They don't like bite their head off in the group. But on the other hand, it's not a good look for a group. I would also urge people as well as individuals, just think very carefully about what you're believing. And bear in mind, if you swallow some of these things and articulate them to other people, it doesn't reflect well on you. You might be embarrassing yourself to some degree as well. Now, David Icke, he's delusional, obviously. To what extent has he lost the plot? I won't attempt some sort of amateur psychiatric diagnosis, but I would suggest he's quite far gone. But just to finish, 2 points. I think the really important quote to remember from Karl Popper: if your theory can explain everything, it actually explains nothing. And the other thing is just a warning. At the moment, David Icke's whipped up this thing, or has contributed to whipping up this thing about 5G masks, so people are burning them. Okay, what about the 1%? They're people. You know, he sort of hints it's the Jews, maybe let's say it's the Chinese, maybe it's the rich. What are people going to start doing to those people when they start thinking they're to blame for coronavirus? And if you look through history, there are lots of examples when these sort of ridiculous conspiracy theories start targeting groups of people, and the results are not good. So I've tried my best here to dismantle David Icke's arguments. But I suppose end on a pessimistic note. Mark Twain said it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled.